Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's meeting of the Commonwealth Club of California, co-sponsored by Cody's Bookstore here in Berkeley. Tonight's program is brought to you from the historic Julia Morgan designed Berkeley City Club in Berkeley, California. It is my pleasure to welcome both the viewers of C-SPAN and the Commonwealth Club radio audience. My name is Judson True, and I will be your chair for this evening. We invite all of the listeners and viewers of tonight's program to visit us on the World Wide Web at commonwealthcluballoneword.org. And if you would please use the question cards on your chairs for tonight's program, we would most appreciate it. They will be collected during the first half of the speech. And now to introduce today's speaker, it is my pleasure to introduce and invite to the podium Mr. Sean Lance, the CEO of the Chiron Corporation. Sean?
Well, good evening. Thank you. It's my pleasure to introduce Peter Jay to you tonight. Peter is currently the economics editor at the BBC, a position that he's held since 1990. Educated at Oxford and a veteran of the Royal Navy, Peter's long and distinguished career includes government service as well as work as a journalist and historian. He served for 6 years in the British Treasury Department before joining the Times as its economics editor. Now, after a decade at the paper, he was appointed ambassador to the United States back in 1977, where he served for 2 years. In the mid-80s, he was chairman of the National Council of Voluntary Organizations and editor of Banking World. Now, he's a frequent presence on British television, and his book, The Wealth of Man, which he is here to discuss with us this evening, is the subject of a major 6-part British BBC documentary that he himself will narrate. The Wealth of Man is an ambitious work that seeks to chronicle the human struggle to satisfy the craving for material improvement from 10,000 BC to the present. The book is not only an effort to understand the past, though it is clearly a serious work of history. Peter's aim is to help us grapple with the uncertain economic future of all of the world's peoples in an age of what has become to be called, perhaps incorrectly, globalization. Now, I will certainly not seek to explain the book any further, since we are fortunate enough to have the author with us here tonight. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Peter Jay. Thank you.
Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I'm extremely grateful for this opportunity given me by the Commonwealth Club to come and talk about my book, to present my book to you this evening. And I'm extremely grateful to you, Chairman, for your introduction. Before I come in further detail to that, perhaps I should ask for your forgiveness if in the course of my remarks I appear to have adopted a rather extraordinary posture here at this rostrum. I want to warn you in advance that it's not that I'm trying to give an imitation of Jerry Lewis imitating a person with a severe pain in the back trying to address a very difficult pool shot. It is that I am blessed or cursed, depending on how you look at it, with very great height and very short sight, and that in order to, therefore, to bring my eyes within the necessary maximum distance of my notes on the podium, it is sometimes necessary for me to adopt this odd posture, but I hope you will forgive me. Introductions, Chairman, are very important, and your very generous and efficient introduction this evening. I noticed you tiptoed tactfully round my 3.5-year period with the publisher Robert Maxwell. Your tactful introduction reminded me in some ways of the time when, which you did refer to, I used to represent my country in this country. The custom then was, and you went some of that way this evening, Chairman, to give more or less the full curriculum vitae, the official biography of the speaker, word for word. And if you're an ambassador, you get called upon to say a few words, as we say in the trade, several times a day, as a result of which I found myself listening to my own CV or resume several times a day. I used to think that if I heard it many more times, I might come to believe it. But it always used to cheer me up in one way, because it contained a sentence that was a wonderful example of something that I had learnt many years before as a very junior civil servant in the British Treasury Department, something called the art of economy in drafting. Now, that's got nothing to do, I'm glad to say, with economics. It has to do with producing the words that are required for some situation. A minister is going to write a letter to a constituent, or make a speech, or answer a question in Parliament, or whatever it may be, to produce the words that are required with the least possible effort on the part of the civil servant having to produce those words. And that mechanism clearly had been at work, because when I arrived in Washington, it must have struck some official, some middle-ranking official, I expect, that the existing document called The Biography of the Ambassador would no longer quite do, because there was now, after all, a different ambassador. My predecessor, I should explain, had given great and distinguished service to his country in some now indeed then forgotten colonial war, and risen to the rank of something like Major General. Now, as a result of all these circumstances, there was this sentence, because I can see that this official had thought that though the existing document wouldn't do, it would be an awful pity to throw away all of that excellent drafting in the existing document. As a result of which there was this sentence which read, "Mr. Jay, after a long, distinguished and gallant period of service in the Royal Navy, rose to the rank of sub-lieutenant." Now, sub-lieutenant, I have to tell you, is the lowest rank in the Royal Navy, as I'm sure it probably is also in the United States Navy. But at least that illustrates the importance of introductions. Now, you mentioned the BBC, Chairman. I should say, as I always do on such occasions, that as everybody knows, the BBC has absolutely no opinions on any subject whatsoever under the sun, and if anything I say sounds in any way like an opinion, I can assure you, you must be mistaken, and I shall of course deny it. Now let me come to the book. I admitted once that I'm not quite sure how, on an occasion like this, I ought to present it. Since the book tries to be a history of the world, or at least of mankind's time so far on Earth, I don't think it would be practical, or indeed endurable for you, if I was to try to give you a potted version of the book in these remarks. Either I should succeed, rather unlikely, which would remove the need for you to read the book, or more probably I should fail and put you off the whole thing. Now, you may, of course, very fairly ask, what do I suppose my qualifications were to address such an ambitious task? And why wasn't a proper academic university historian retained to do the job? Well, ladies and gentlemen, I don't really think it is for me to try to answer that question. My publisher did me the honor of asking me, and the BBC did me the honor of asking me to present and be the author of the television series, and I found both those tasks irresistibly fascinating. I've always believed that the job of the journalist, and that's what I've been most of my life, and of the historian are logically the same. What they boil down to is the task of finding out, reporting, and explaining. Those three words: to find out, to report, and to explain what has happened. All history, I think, and all journalism is embodied in those simple words. Trying to explain what I think are important and sometimes complicated events and issues on paper and on radio and in television for laymen is what I've spent a good slice of my life doing, and I've very much enjoyed. In addition, the basic question of economic history: how and why did mankind get from there to here? From wandering about 12,000 years ago, picking blackberries and taking pot shots at passing woolly mammoths, and not looking at all like the species most likely to succeed, to where we are today, when the chief threat to our survival as a species may well be ourselves, That question must command, I think, the interest of almost anybody who thinks about human life on this planet. Anyway, it certainly commanded mine. Having spent much of my life trying to follow and understand rather ephemeral economic events, a boom here, a bust there, a currency crisis here and there, it seemed rank cowardice to duck the challenge of trying, at least once before I became terminally gaga, to write down a coherent, though it could certainly never be definitive, account of the whole economic story of man, trying both to tell the tale as it happened and in the process to answer the central question of economic history: what is it that makes different societies and the same society at different times prosper and stagnate, grow and decline, leap forward and then sometimes fall back? That very broadly has been, in my mind, the agenda of the book. My answer contains two basic and linked thoughts. One is that government matters as a key determinant, both positively and frequently negatively, of economic success. And the second is that economic history proceeds in a manner somewhat reminiscent of the basic steps of the classical waltz, which are, as far as I remember, one step forward and two steps sideways. And the sideways may sometimes be slightly backwards or sometimes be slightly forwards. Now, this waltz idea is explained in the book early on, and then by repeated reference in most chapters as the story unfolds and where it seems most apt. I'd like to share with you the key passage in the book introducing it. The waltz motif simply asserts as a frequently encountered pattern, though certainly not as an iron law, that 1, from time to time an economic advance is made, for example, the development of agriculture, by chance opportunity or by a development in knowledge or technique, which apparently enables more mouths to be fed, or existing mouths to be better fed, or living standards to be raised in one way or another. 2, this advance provokes predatory threats, for example, external raiders or internal idlers from one or another species of outsider or free rider who hopes to secure the fruits of the advance for himself without the costs or effort required to support the advance. And 3, these threats invite, and they may or may not attract, a social political solution. For example, structured settlements with rulers, whereby the original advance is protected from predation by rules prohibiting or discouraging such conduct, and or by direct policing and military defense. It is, ladies and gentlemen, the stability or otherwise of the social political solutions achieved in this third step that frequently determines how far, where, and for how long the fruits of the original purely economic advance are enjoyed. It is because step 1 provokes step 2, and because step 3 can always fail, that whole civilizations, as well as lesser economic units, are frequently found to retrogress, to go backwards economically, and sometimes to fail altogether. Although, of course, natural calamity can sometimes do the job without the aid of human political incompetence or military inferiority. It's for this reason that the economic historian who wishes to explain man's economic advance and its frequent interruptions and failures is necessarily drawn deeply into the observation and description of the social, cultural, and political structures and values which man has devised to facilitate and protect his economic progress. Without them, purely economic advance isn't enough, and it soon fails. And however much the economic historian seeks to confine his agenda to purely economic events and their explanation, he is rapidly obliged to concern himself with the total organization and governance of societies. If not for their own sake, at least as necessary ingredients in the understanding of the purely economic story. Adam Smith, the great Adam Smith, went before us in this as in so much else. Indeed, he diagnosed a version of the waltz motif at the very heart of his explanation of the wealth of man and of nations and of why they should grow. He called it the natural progress of opulence. It all starts, he believed, in the nature of man, in his innate curiosity and competitiveness, allied to a perpetual disposition to ameliorate his material condition, in other words, to seek wealth. This, Smith thought, led to the division of labor and the growth of knowledge, similar in broad concept to step one of our waltz motif. This thesis immediately ran into its antithesis in the form of what Smith saw as the practical inhibitions to growth, mainly predation by the powerful within a society and by outside invaders, as well as by the monopolistic tendencies of merchants and manufacturers and by slavery. Synthesis was then found, where success occurred, in social and political developments such as the emergence of towns and markets, the evolution of the middle class, the political matrix of citizenship, state power, rents and taxes, and the reinforcing legitimization of these structures by value systems based on kinship, status, the state, and religion. Now that reading from the book, I hope, makes the link between the waltz motif thought and the importance of government obvious. For the third step of each waltz motif is an essentially political one. It's the moment at which a society either finds a way of sharing and enjoying the increment in prosperity which has occurred at step one and which has been threatened at step two, or fails to do so, with the likely consequence that the original step forward is not sustained and may even be converted into a retreat. That ability or inability of people in groups ranging from early villages of a few dozen to modern countries of hundreds of millions of inhabitants determines whether they grow or decline. What is required is an act of government, perhaps of self-government, perhaps of constitution making, but essentially anyway of rule making, whereby it is determined how wealth may be created in a society, how it shall be shared, and what forms of ownership with what rights shall be recognized and protected. If the rules don't leave those who generate economic wealth with sufficient incentives to keep doing so, production and enterprise will decline. If the rules don't leave those who lack wealth with a sufficient stake in the society, they too may withdraw from or even disrupt such an economy. Good government gets these balances right, maximizing both opportunity and fairness as perceived by its citizens, as well as providing for an economic and effective defense against external attack. Bad government does the reverse. In the television series that you spoke of, Chairman, we developed this thought in front of a splendid great fresco by the Italian Renaissance painter Lorenzetti in the town hall at Siena, which vividly depicts the contrast. One wall is good government, the next wall is bad government. Now, in the book, I illustrate the theme with a long quotation from Yung Chang's Wild Swans, which I describe, despite the fact that it's essentially a personal memoir, as arguably the best, most penetrating and enjoyable textbook of the nature of economic growth that I have ever read. My favorite passage includes the following. All around me, Yung Chang writes of her memories of being 6 years old, uplifting music blared from loudspeakers, and there were banners, posters, and huge slogans painted on the walls proclaiming, "Long live the Great Leap Forward," and "Everybody make steel." Chairman Mao, ordered steel output to be doubled in 1 year. Nearly 100 million peasants were pulled out of agricultural work and into steel production. They had been the labor force producing much of the country's food. Mountains were stripped bare of trees for fuel. But the output of this mass production amounted only to what people called cattle droppings, meaning useless turds. Mao's fixation on steel went largely unquestioned, as did his other obsessions. He took a dislike to sparrows. They devour grain. So every household was mobilized. We sat outside ferociously beating any metal object, from cymbals to saucepans, to scare the sparrows off the trees so that they would eventually drop dead from exhaustion. That summer, 1958, all of China was organized into these new units, people's communes, each containing between 2,000 and 20,000 households. The regime effectively banned eating at home. Every peasant had to eat in the commune canteen. The peasants filed into the canteens every day after work and ate to their heart's content. They consumed and wasted the entire food reserve in the countryside. With no incentive to work, they just went to the fields and had a good snooze. Agriculture was also neglected because of the priority given to steel. Many of the peasants were exhausted from having to spend long hours finding fuel, scrap iron and iron ore, and keeping the furnaces going. The fields were often left to the women and children, who had to do everything by hand, as the animals were busy making their contribution to steel production. When harvest time came in autumn 1958, few people were in the fields. The failure to get in the harvest in 1958 flashed a warning that a food shortage was on its way. As the 60s began, a great famine spread across the whole of China. An accepted estimate, Yung Chang writes, of the death toll for the whole country is around 30 million people. Now that from Yung Chang is, I think, an exceptionally vivid example of the ravages which bad government, really bad government, can inflict on any economy. But we can find in contemporary Russia the other form of bad government, not too much but too little, or at least failing to fulfill the primary duties of government to create sufficient social stability and protection from lawless bullies for normal economic life to develop. History provides many other examples of the disastrous consequences of anarchy and, of course, war itself. However important as government is to the story, and helpful as I believe the waltz motif can be in picturing some of its patterns, I would mislead you badly if I left you with the impression that I thought that was the whole of the economic story of mankind. In the book, I also say that the discovery of agriculture and the discovery of compound growth of economic output, otherwise the Industrial Revolution and what's followed it, were changes of profounder importance than any others, though of course it remains incumbent upon us to continue to delve into their own antecedent causes. Agriculture revolutionized the productivity of land, and industry revolutionized the productivity of labor. Between them, they account for, if they don't completely explain, the main quantitative changes in mankind's material condition. When the noted British archaeologist Stephen Mythen said that if you look at the last 100,000 years, the start of farming is the biggest transformation that has occurred, and after it has happened, well, the rest just unfolds as history, he is half right. The great growth in human numbers is thereby enabled. But the other half, the great growth in living standards in the industrial world over the last 2 centuries, the final seconds of archaeological time, is more than just history. Oversimplifying bravely, but not, I think, intolerably, One may say that agriculture enabled mankind to increase 1,000-fold in number over the last 10,000 years. We saw in Chapter 1 that one hunter-gatherer needed something like 25 square kilometers of favorable territory to make a living, whereas even the earliest agriculture could support 20 people on a single square kilometer, a ratio of 500 to 1, though it naturally took most of the time since then for that potential to be anywhere nearly fully exploited. If we disregard new additions of favorable territories since the earliest days, we would still only need, by arithmetic, a microscopic further annual growth in agricultural land efficiency of less than 0.05% a year to provide the extra food necessary to feed the 1,000-fold increase, 1,000 times greater, that has occurred in our population over that period. In other words, the discovery of agriculture enabled the population to increase 500 times, and improvements in its efficiency enabled one further doubling of that result. Actual food supply has, of course, increased even more than that, because 4/5 of the world's population are living today at better than subsistence levels. But that extra can be ascribed to the impact of the Industrial Revolution on agriculture, as in the role of the tractor and in the Green Revolution. What agriculture did not do was greatly to raise the productivity of farm labor, or indeed of anybody's labor, because there wasn't anybody else. Indeed, we saw in Chapter 1 that early farm societies worked much longer hours and lived harder lives than the hunter-gatherers they replaced. That helps to explain why the main effect of the huge increase in land productivity went, as the millennia rolled by, into increased population rather than into higher living standard. The land could produce 500 times as much food and eventually 1,000 times as much. But if we disregard the extra effects of the Industrial Revolution on food production, we would expect it to have taken something approaching as many people to produce each hundredweight of food, and therefore eventually 500 times as many people to produce, by 1960, the 500-fold increase in potential global food supply, when the population was in fact 3 billion, which equals 6 million, which is what it was when we started 12,000 years ago, multiplied by 500. Now, likewise, industry, by investing in and otherwise harnessing an indefinitely growing body of technical skill and knowledge to the task of increasing economic output in quantity and quality, gave mankind for the first time the prospect of significant output growth at compound interest for an indefinitely long future period. And this growth, unlike the growth in farm production, didn't require a more or less equivalent increase in human numbers to produce it. It could be produced by an increase in output per head. And this, over 2 centuries, delivered what a leading economic historian, D.N. McCloskey, calls the heart of the matter 12, the factor by which real incomes per head now exceed what it was in 1780 in countries that have experienced modern economic growth. No other episode of enrichment approaches modern economic growth in what it has done for the living standards of those humans affected by it, just as nothing approaches what the discovery of agriculture has done for human numbers. In this way, I think we can reconcile Mythen's view, crudely paraphrased as saying that after the agricultural revolution it was all over by the history, with John Maynard Keynes' view that there was no significant progress in the human condition before 1700, or as he actually phrased it in a passage that bears quoting, from the earliest times of which we have record, back say to 2,000 years before Christ, down to the beginning of the 18th century, there was no very great change in the standard of life of the average man living in the civilized centers of the earth. Ups and downs certainly, visitations of plague, famine and war, golden intervals, but no progressive violent change. Some periods perhaps 50% better than others, at the utmost 100% better in the 4,000 years which ended, say, in AD 1700. But what of the future? Keynes believed, when he wrote the words I've just quoted, that within 100 years, by the year 2030, mankind would have solved its economic problem, namely the struggle for subsistence in a world where the necessities of life were scarce. Compound economic growth, he believed, would do the job. Now, exactly 100 years earlier, Thomas Babington Macaulay, the great British historian and essayist, had challenged the pessimists of his time to say why 1930 shouldn't be as much better than 1830, as he said 1830 was better than 1730. When Daniel Defoe, the author of Treasure Island, had recently written his memorable tour of Great Britain. Well, ladies and gentlemen, here is my own conclusion, which will, I hope, whet your appetite for the story which leads up to it in the book. It's time to answer our own Malthusian question. How sure should we be that the planet can supply and otherwise sustain a geometric progression of production, either to meet the needs of an exponentially growing population or to fulfill the aspirations of a stable population for exponentially rising living standards? On that, more than on any other question, should depend our answers to Macaulay's question, why we shouldn't expect the future to deliver the same glorious onward march of progress that distinguishes the past, and to Keynes's question, whether we have finally solved the economic problem. Our answer to the first is that it can't be taken for granted as a proposition derivable from within economic science, nor as a reliable consequence of the fact that Malthusian rigors seem to have been avoided by large parts of the human race for at least a few centuries, nor yet as a certain guarantee given by the ceaseless advance of science. Maybe global population will stop rising for a while in the middle of the 21st century, and maybe it will not resume its growth before that century's end, though these are very big maybes. But mankind's potential collision course with the limits, or at least limitations, of his physical environment will not be deflected simply by demographic stability. The progress of opulence as a disposition of mankind will continue. Gross domestic products per head will rise, and therefore GDPs will rise whether fourfold, eightfold, or 12-fold every 100 years. And if this requires a systematic fouling of our own nest by mankind, fouling of a kind that feeds back to us as climate change, rising oceans, expanding deserts, vanishing forests, and intensifying conflicts of interest between the West and the East and between the North and South, then a growing rather than the presently falling proportion of mankind may be struggling for subsistence, finding themselves, the unfortunates, sandwiched between the rock of growth and the hard place of the planet's not quite limitless capacity. That is what Malthus feared was mankind's fated lot. To return, however high he soared, and however long he might for a while escape from the trap, to the point where his numbers were curtailed by the privations to which at least parts of the species were subjected. Such an outcome would obviously be the opposite, the antithesis of Keynes' prediction of a final solution to the economic problem of how to subsist in a world of scarcity. Keynes's optimism was based on the formidable potential of economic growth at compound interest of the kind unleashed by the Industrial Revolution. He included provisos that about population growth and war, but naturally enough, the possibility that such growth itself might have such an impact on our planetary environment as to damage it as a human habitat and so create a problem of subsistence for even stable numbers of people didn't occur to him. But even without that new peril, there are other reasons for being sure that by 2030, Keynes's century from when Keynes wrote, we will not be suffering, as he suggested, some kind of nervous breakdown as a consequence of being deprived of the purpose for which evolution has so deeply prepared and programmed us, namely to sweat for our daily bread. Keynes was a creature of the Cambridge, of G. Moore, and of the Bloomsbury, of Lytton, Strachey, and Virginia Woolf. He believed that the highest good resided not in great piles of wealth, but in the best states of mind that could be enjoyed by those who had the good fortune and the ability to contemplate truth, beauty, and goodness, and to immerse themselves in the joys of friendship. For him, therefore, it was possible to believe in a finite level of wealth comfortably above subsistence, beyond which mankind would be free to return to some of the most sure and certain principles of religion and traditional virtue, that avarice is vice, that the exaction of usury is a misdemeanor, and the love of money is detestable, that those who walk most truly in the paths of virtue and sane wisdom who take least thought for the morrow. We shall once more value ends above means and prefer the good to the useful, he wrote. Well, we may dream of such a world, we may admire it, and we may hanker after it, but we can't believe in it because it reckons without Darwin and without Adam Smith too. The progress of opulence does not stop when subsistence is left behind. And those who choose the life of leisure and the pleasures of the mind, high thinking and the living standards of Cambridge in the 1930s, will be outrun and outflanked in wealth, power, and survival by those who continue to obey what Keynes contemptuously called the pseudo-moral principles which have hag-ridden us for 200 years, by which we have exalted some of the most distasteful of human qualities into the position of the highest virtue. Those semi-criminal, semi-pathological propensities, he wrote, which one hands over with a shudder to the specialists in mental disease, such as all kinds of social customs and economic practices affecting the distribution of wealth and of economic rewards and penalties, which we now maintain at all costs, however distasteful and unjust they may be in themselves, because they're tremendously useful in promoting the accumulation of capital. Keynes' dream of subverting the bourgeois world by bursting through into a higher plateau of affluence in which greed and thrift and toil are superfluous is, I think, unrealizable. Not because such levels of output are unattainable, they will be attained even earlier than Keynes surmised, but because the propensity to go on striving for yet higher peaks will continue in the breasts of enough members of the human race to ensure that it is they, and not those who opt for the economic bliss of cultivating the arts of life rather than the activities of purpose, who dominate the subsequent story. In that sense, Darwin always wins in the end. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I had intended to add various other readings from my book which show you that it's not all such solemn stuff, that there are some lighter passages and we have some fun along the way. But I think as the clock is moving on, I should conclude at that point and allow you to ask any questions if you have them, and then I shall know that I'm talking about things that at least interest you, and if there's time we can come back to the lighter moments later. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Peter Jay, author of The Wealth of Man. As you can imagine, we have a large number of questions, maybe not covering 12,000 years, but definitely covering a wide variety of subjects. And the first question will be, does democratic capitalism as it exists today have the capacity to address some of the long-term strategic, economic, social, political, environmental questions that you describe as crucial?
Well, thank you. That's a question that goes absolutely to the heart of the matter. And if I were to stand here and say I could give you the answer to that question in 2 sentences, I should be claiming something which you would know was not true. I think the challenge implied in that question is arguably the greatest, certainly the greatest challenge in political development that we face. If I may just take a little corner of the question, it seems to me to be reasonably clear at this moment that our society faces a number of challenges, a small number of which could be regarded as global in the sense that they seem to have the potential of threatening literally the survival of the human species on this planet, not over the millions and zillions of years from which we all know everything will be swept away by astronomical changes, but even in the next century or so. There is no doubt, I think in my mind, to take one example, that the changes affecting our climate, while they don't seem to imply the threat to the survival of the human species, certainly imply threats of a very profound kind to its habitat. Now, one of the things that is very clear about those threats is that they take place over a long time, that the action required to deal with them is action which needs to be taken a very long time before, as it were, 12 o'clock, a very long time before one is facing catastrophe on the ground, decades and maybe even more than decades. Now, and secondly, it is clear that that action needs to be effective at a global level. Climate change is not something that can be dealt with country by country, let alone state by state, or locality by locality. Now, we also know that it is a very clear characteristic of the political process as we have it, democratic capitalism, if you like, that insofar as it reacts to problems that confront it, it does so at the last possible minute. It is not a characteristic of that process that people rush out to vote or to write their politicians and say, hey, look, something very terrible is maybe going to happen in 100 years' time. I think you should increase my taxes, or I think you should do something else which will call for immediate sacrifice. On the contrary, they're rather disposed to say that the opposite should happen, and if somebody else says it should happen, they're extremely inclined to say that that there is no need for this, to question the premises, or even or to suggest that the proposed solution, even if in theory it's necessary, is in one way or another unfair and ought to be recast in a different form. It is extremely hard, in other words, for large democratic societies to grapple with these problems in a timely way. It is infinitely more hard for a world of 6 billion people going on 8.9 billion, where it's supposed to level off towards the middle of the present century, to make early and effective decisions and then to police them and implement them for a whole globe made up of small and medium-sized and one or two large nation states, none of whom come under the government or control of any global authority, who therefore could make such a decision. And it remains, therefore, for global solutions to be negotiated as best possible between this large number of extremely unequal, ramshackle, left over by accidents of history, nation states. Now, from time to time, they seem to rise to these challenges, or half rise to them, or two-thirds rise to them, and something gets done. But to put one's hand on one's heart and say that it is a probability, let alone a certainty, that for each and every one of the global problems, the global threats to the survival of mankind, all the societies who make up the global community will, in a timely way, reach the right conclusions, come together and agree on the right conclusions, establish, implement and police programs to that effect, seems to me to be predicting something which runs contrary to all our experience of democratic life. It is the length of the time scale and the global nature of the problems which puts it, on the face of it, beyond the normal reflexes, responses and capabilities of the political system that we have. And therefore I do think that we have very profound reasons to worry about this. Now, that's not a reason, I'm not advocating despair. I think that if we succeed in recognizing that problem as a fundamental problem of political architecture in the world, we may yet, as we have done in the past in various ways, rise even to that challenge. We may devise solutions and devise new ways of making policies and reaching agreements and implementing them, which enables us to meet those challenges. But I certainly don't think that the way in which the world has been run, even since 1945, let alone before, on the face of it, has at all a good probability of measuring up to the problems that were hinted at in the question. Thank you very much.
Here's another question that calls upon your powers of prophecy. What do you think will be the next economic theory to challenge capitalism now that socialism, communism are viewed as failures, or will there be such a theory?
Another very profound and important question to which also I don't know the answer. If I did know what it was, I would be advocating it myself, I suppose. On the face of it, I don't expect there to be a new great ideology in an economically based ideology. I think that the story of Marxism, that species of communism, has been an extraordinary story. It really did start from very largely from the writings of one man, Karl Marx, and spread and developed into a ideological system which then became part of the governance of significant parts of the world and part of the competition in the world between two powerful competing systems. I don't think it is very likely that something like that will happen again. I think at the moment anyway we are rather more skeptical about ideologies. I think that at the moment and foreseeably for the next decade or so, absent, give or take, the sort of very short-term crises, the world is working sufficiently successfully for 4/5 of the world's population to make it somewhat unlikely that there would be a rush into a new ideological system that would threaten in some fundamental way to overturn the existing system. I think that the collapse of communism has also contributed to a lack of confidence in ideologies as such, and to a preference for what people think of as more pragmatic systems, though of course pragmatism is itself an ideology, and what the political and economic arrangements under which most of us now live are themselves the results of theories and of ideas and of political science and philosophers and writers. Better theories, we have to hope and believe, than those of Karl Marx, but nonetheless they are, in one sense, no less theoretical. But I think it's rather unlikely that that somebody will write a book like Das Kapital, which will take over the minds of large numbers of people in the economic sphere. What might happen in the field of religion or spiritual affairs, spiritual thinking and so on, that is a much wider speculation. It seems to me that it is always possible that spiritual revolutions of one kind or another, new religions, may capture people's imaginations and persuade them rightly or wrongly that that is what they need. But I'm rather skeptical that there will be another great ideology. If there were one, I presume it would be based initially on some kind of rejection of those parts of the existing world which don't seem to work very well. The things that young people at Seattle and at Washington and I think this coming weekend possibly in Prague, wish to protest about and reject about the existing world, all gathered together under the title of globalization, is a very long agenda of not coherently related items. And I don't think all of these people at all agree with each other about what it is that's wrong. But they all agree with that, as it were, they haven't got it now, or they haven't now got the kind of world that they would like to see. I think there could be a revival of nationalism, is what it boils down to. I mean, rejection of globalization is essentially a wish to assert the control and identity of more local units than the globe. And those are likely to be essentially nation states or even possibly smaller states. So if there were an ideological shift, I think it would be one in the direction of nationalism and the things that go with economic nationalism: self-sufficiency, barriers to free trade, barriers to movements of currency and money, a return in some ways to the world as it was in the 1930s, and has been at other times in history. In my opinion, the consequences of that would be very grave, not only for economic success but also for peace in the world, because economic nationalism engenders frictions and conflicts between nations which are, and have in the past, led to war, and which are extremely dangerous. But I think if there were an ideological shift, the most likely direction in which it would go would be in that direction. I hope that doesn't happen, because I think that would be very bad news for almost all of us.
How would you compare the Industrial Revolution to today's Internet revolution? Will the changes that are being wrought today have the same fundamental, long-lasting, and wide-ranging impact of the Industrial Revolution?
You ask all the right questions. I discussed this question a little bit in the book, and therefore I'll give a shorter answer. Now, there are people, serious, informed and intelligent people, who do claim that the internet, or at least more broadly the artificial intelligence revolution, the IT revolution, is to be compared in importance with the other two great revolutions in the economic story, the agricultural revolution and the industrial revolution. Now, the test that one has to apply to put them in that league, that's the super league, that's the national league, as it were, of economic events. And there are only two so far in the last 12,000 years, so the tests are pretty demanding to get into that class. The tests are that they have a transforming effect. This is not the test that I've invented, this is taking it from the literature, that they have a transforming effect on the economic lives of most people. That following the agricultural revolution, following the industrial revolution, the lives of most people in the places where they occurred was not merely affected or hugely affected, but transformed. And the question is whether the internet or IT or artificial intelligence, whatever you want to precisely pick on, will have a transforming effect, comparably. My judgment is that we cannot yet say that, and we may never be able to say it, that there is not evidence yet. It's not to be excluded as a possibility down the track, but there is not evidence yet that would justify one in saying that in that fundamental way the lives of most people will be transformed in consequence of this immensely important development. That clearly IT enables very large numbers of people to do very large numbers of things more conveniently, more quickly, more efficiently, more successfully than they could do them before. And clearly, in a sense, it enables more people to do things that previously only a few people could do. But whether it yet enables people in general to do things which could not be done at all before, which is essentially what agriculture and the industrial revolutions did, seems to me to be going beyond anything that we can yet see for certain on the ground. There are some things that it can probably do that couldn't be done before at all, particularly in the areas of very, very large number crunching like long-range weather forecasting. But as a general transforming experience of mankind in general, no, I don't think it yet belongs in that class. I may be proved to be wrong. I might be proved to be wrong quite quickly, though I don't think one could make a judgment of that kind in less than about 50 years from the beginning of the IT, the serious beginning of the IT revolution.
Here's another question. You write that the Black Death had a serious impact upon industrial production in Egypt and Syria, resulting in the Sultan's decision to take an oppressive approach to collecting revenues. Would you predict the same of HIV/AIDS?
I'm in great trouble about the Black Death because in response to an SOS from some editor of Time magazine, I allowed myself to contribute a brief piece about one aspect of the Black Death that interested him, which is in my book, which is that rather over 100 years after it, some of the effects of the huge drop in population, forget that something like 30% of the population of Europe was killed by the Black Death, and the population of Europe fell for a while very significantly. Some of the long-range consequences of that were economically important in that by making labour extremely scarce, it hugely increased its bargaining power with the existing landowners and employers of labour and led to the, in consequence, effective breakdown of the feudal system and opened the gateways, it has been argued, to more modern economic developments. And I was accused by at least one correspondent I have of writing this in the context of a general discussion of HIV, of trying to see a silver lining in the AIDS problem. That wasn't what I wanted to argue, and I don't think that anything can possibly conceivably lead us to say either of the Black Death or of AIDS that in some sense this is worthwhile because of long-range economic consequences. I certainly think that if AIDS reaches the point as an epidemic or pandemic of having the sort of effect on numbers, or even a fraction of the effect on numbers that the Black Death had, yes, there may well be governments in parts of Africa and elsewhere who would be alarmed at the effects on their revenue and who would seek to maintain their revenue in order to maintain their expenditure plans and thereby increase the tax burden they imposed per head. And clearly that would add to the oppression. But one should, that's only part of, and one of the negative effects of an appalling event such as the Black Death. If the immediate effects of the Black Death for 50 to 100 years were economically negative, quite apart from the sort of universal human tragedy of it, the productive capacity of Europe effectively collapsed. Markets collapsed. There was nobody to gravely reduced numbers producing things, gravely reduced numbers consuming things. The economic effect was exceedingly, catastrophically negative. And nobody should be under any illusions, in my opinion, that if AIDS were to have any similar effect, I don't yet know whether it might, but if it were, that there's anything good about this. There is nothing good about it at all. It would be, first and foremost, it would be a human tragedy on a inconceivably or barely conceivably large scale, but secondly, economically, it would, all of its effects for a very long time would be extremely negative. And if there were any very long-term positive effects of the kind that Black Death had in shaking up the feudal system, they are so far away that I don't think we need to spend very much time thinking about them.
Unfortunately, we've reached that point in the program where we have time for just one last question, and this is from an audience member who's thinking about a little different questions. And the question is, what is the most amusing thing that happened to you as ambassador to the United States from Great Britain?
I hate those questions more than all other questions. My mind always goes entirely and completely blank, and it's gone entirely and completely blank on this occasion. Amusement is not the predominant theme of that particular job. You work incredibly hard, incredibly long hours, and as I used to say quite regularly, they need a younger man for this job. I was then under 40, so I used to get a bit of a titter for that, but not much more. I will think about this, and if I can think of it, I shall relay it to you later on in the proceedings. It was a wonderful experience and an uplifting experience and an important experience, but I wouldn't say it was in general an amusing experience.
Our thanks to Ambassador Peter Jay, author of The Wealth of Man and economics editor of the BBC. Thank you. I'd also like to thank our audience listening on radio and watching on C-SPAN. Now this meeting of the Commonwealth Club of California is adjourned.